Melbourne, in the early part of this century, the bustling capital of a busy state. Electricity was new to the city then. Only a few years before, the streets had been lit with gas. There were no electric trams, no electric trains. Victoria depended on black coal for railways, for industry, for gas, for electricity. Black coal that had to come by colliers from New South Wales because Victoria had little black coal of its own. Strikes in shipping and on the coalfields brought industrial dislocation. During the First World War, strikes caused fuel shortages so severe that the Victorian government reopened the old brown coal mine near Morwell in the Latrobe Valley. Worked for a time in the 1890s, the mine had long been abandoned. Now men went to work to win as much coal as they could. Men of vision had long seen Victoria's brown coal as the source of power it had become in Germany, where experience had shown that although raw brown coal was a low-grade fuel, it served well when burnt in special furnaces near where it was won. In 1917, the Victorian government appointed a committee of investigation under Hyman Herman, the state geologist, who is now regarded as the father of brown coal. The committee recommended the development of the Latrobe Valley's extensive brown coal fields to provide fuel and electricity for Victoria. On their report, the government acted, and Sir Arthur Robinson, Solicitor General and Minister for Public Works, drafted the bill that became law, the Electricity Commissioners Act, in 1919. 1919, the year of the first flight from England to Australia. Prime Minister Hughes presented a cheque for £10,000 to Ross and Keith Smith. In March, the Electricity Commissioners were appointed. Sir Thomas Lyell, scientist, chairman. George Swinburne, engineer. Sir Archibald McKinstry, who resigned after 4 months, and was replaced by Sir Robert Gibson, businessman. The commissioners set up their office in the basement of Melbourne's old Geological Museum, appointed their first officer, Secretary Roy Littleow, and went to work. Electricity supply was chaotic. Different authorities, different voltages, phases, frequencies, AC, DC, and interruptions, caused by the shortage of black coal. At the end of 1919, the Electricity Commissioners reported in favour of an electricity generating project based on the brown coal fields near Morwell. Parliament approved the project. In 1920, the Commissioners began organising a workforce in the Latrobe Valley on the site later named Yallourn. At the same time, they organised accommodation of a sort. Now, a new man came into the picture, General Sir John Monash. As commander of the Australians in France in the First World War, he had welcomed Prime Minister Hughes. He was a distinguished soldier and a distinguished civil engineer. In October 1920, he became general manager and, a few months later, the first full-time chairman of what was now the State Electricity Commission of Victoria. In February 1921, Monash and the commissioners were in the Latrobe Valley to see the first sod turned at the power station site. Men and horses were stripping away the soil above the brown coal, the overburden. A temporary power station generated electricity for the project and for the people of Tyres nearby, the Commission's first country customers. Building began. The power station, the briquette factory, near the open cut, a town started to rise. Homes for workers and their families. The first planned town in Australia. The methods of winning and using the brown coal were developed in Germany, then the only country in the world doing this work. Today, the steam shovel looks crude and slow, but to men swinging shovels by hand, it was a great improvement. Steam locomotives dragged the overburden to dumps beside the Latrobe River. The day was coming closer when brown coal would be the vital source of power for Victoria. By mid-1921, the Commission had its own headquarters in Melbourne. The 7 workers in the basement room had grown to more than 1,000 across the state, and Monash led them in turning plans to action. To provide urgently needed power for the metropolitan area, construction of the Commission's first power station, Newport B, was begun in 1921. Early in 1922, work started on the power line from the Latrobe Valley to Melbourne. It was the first in the British Commonwealth to carry power at 132,000 volts. When the first tower went up, Monash was there. He took a personal interest in all the work. The Latrobe Valley site now had its new name, Yallourn, a combination of the Aboriginal words for brown and fire, and new equipment. The overburden now went to the conveyors of a boom stacker that spread the earth over the dumps. There were difficulties. The overburden was doughy clay, hard to work. Sometimes it seemed to be actively fighting the men. There were problems at the power station too. There was more moisture in the coal than had been expected. Plans had to be modified, equipment redesigned. But month by month, the work neared its first success. On the 15th of June 1924, power generated from brown coal flowed down the line to Melbourne. The coal was won from the new open cut with a huge steam shovel. The shovel swung the coal to a crusher, and ropeways carried the coal on to a screen house. More ropeways carried the coal further to the power station and to the briquette factory. "1924 saw another achievement. The briquette factory began production, the first large-scale plant outside Europe. Crushed, dried and compressed in the factory, with nothing added, brown coal became a compact, efficient source of heat. 1924 saw the coming of wireless. Monash was among the first to use the new method of communication, to tell the people of Victoria what the Commission was doing. Across the state, men were clearing the way for new power lines. The southwestern line, Geelong to Warrnambool, had been completed in 1923. In 1924, men were working on the northeastern line to link Melbourne with Shepparton, Wangaratta, Albury. On the open plains with machines to help, it still wasn't easy work. The men faced problems that had no ready answer. In the mountains, the work was hardest. Men struggled with their gear up slopes of 1 in 1. Driving was a tricky job on the greasy slopes, but one car had to get through, the pay car. Going downhill, the driver tied a sapling behind, jammed his brakes on, and hoped for the best. When cars, horses and tractors failed, bullocks were called in. The Commission had its own team and its own driver, with a traditional name, Bill Bullock, but apparently without the traditional language. Off duty, he was a lay preacher. For the line builders, an abandoned home and a row or two of tents made a camp. No luxury, but the men were young, most of them, and all of them were tough. Many could remember worse conditions. They were diggers of the First World War, like Monash himself. Every Anzac Day, Monash put on his uniform to lead his returned soldiers. He was one of Australia's great men, in war and in peace. Soldier, scholar, engineer. His genius guided the Commission through the difficulties and criticisms of the early years. From the start, hydroelectricity had been investigated. In 1928, the first hydropower stations came into service. A complex of raceways, pipelines, dams, and 4 power stations harnessed the energy of the Rubicon and Royston rivers in central Victoria. All 4 stations were directed by one man. The system was among the first in the world to be remotely controlled. The nearby Sugarloaf Reservoir provided complementary hydropower. The Rubicon and Royston streams produced most power in winter when water flow was at its highest. In summer, Sugarloaf waters, released for irrigation, drove the generators of the power station. They produced electricity first in 1928. At Yallourn now, houses and paved roads had replaced tents and tracks sloppy with mud. If it still looked stark, trees were growing and lawns in the city square turning green. There were schools and churches, and the people boasted that the hotel was the first all-electric in the Southern Hemisphere. So it should have been, alongside the power complex, where the first stage was now complete. All 6 generators of Yallourn's first power station were now operating. The Commission was now supplying nearly all the electricity requirements of Melbourne. And in 1928, the Commission made its first profit. Power lines were reaching further and further into country districts. In the 1920s, there were some very surprised cows. The electric motor brought a revolution in farming. Chaff cutting was easier when motor power replaced arm power. Conveyors were more efficient than shovels. By now, the Commission was supplying more than 100 centres outside the city and its suburbs. In homes, ladies were using electric hairdryers. Gentlemen pressing their trousers with what were called electric valets. Life's worries were massaged away electrically. If the breakfast table looks more like a salesman's dream than any real table, it still shows the impact of electricity. The theory of this seems to be that electricity replaces the ashtray, but that depends as much on a willing wife as a willing electric servant. The slogan of the day was, "Do it electrically, it's cheaper." Surely he hasn't dropped ash up there. But if he has, electricity will cope. People were talking about the roaring 20s. Everyone was having a good time. But as well as play, there was work. Industry was quick to take advantage of electricity. A quarry's trucks were hauled by electric motors. Monash was right when he said demand never falls off, it always grows. No one who uses an electric motor would go back to a steam engine. When you build an electricity supply system, you persuade many to use electricity who have never done so before. Briquettes were now popular as fuel for homes and industry. More than 20 depots were set up at railway stations around Melbourne. Briquettes proved their value again and again. A reliable, solid fuel at relatively low cost that stood between Victoria and industrial dislocation. Towards the end of 1931, the Commission suffered a grave loss. Sir John Monash died. His body lay in state in Queen's Hall at Parliament House. "300,000 people lined the streets to mourn his passing. He had led the Commission through its first 11 years and set it firmly on the path to success. In Yallourn, the people set up a monument to Monash. But all around was a greater monument. There was the growing town of Yallourn. there was the power and fuel complex built under Monash's leadership and guidance. The open cut was almost completely mechanized now. Electric dredgers had replaced steam shovels. Electric locomotives had made ropeways obsolete. Yallourn A station had been complete for 3 years. The first extension, Yallourn B, was under construction. The monument to Monash was a growing monument. The Commission's second chairman was Francis Clements, one of the real pioneers of electricity in Australia. He faced the great economic depression of the 30s with its many problems. These did not include loss of customers. All through the depression, demand for power rose. The Commission had been criticized for being optimistic in its forecast of demand. In fact, in the second 10 years, demand more than doubled. A second 132,000-volt line now linked Yallourn with Melbourne. 1934 was Melbourne's centenary year. It began with celebrations marked by a royal visit, the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester. Before the year ended, wild weather brought the greatest floods ever recorded in Victoria. To the Commission, the floods meant disaster. The Latrobe River burst through levee banks and poured into the open cut at 5 million gallons a minute. The open cut became a huge lake. For months, water was pumped from the open cut. Supply was not interrupted. Every other power station worked to capacity. In 5 months, some coal was being won. In 6, 10,000 tons a day. The Commission had been set up to provide a unified power system for Victoria. As the 30s went on, the achievement came nearer. Power lines kept reaching across the state. In 1937, George Jobbins became chairman as expansion continued. He was another pioneer of electricity in Victoria. The Kiowa snows as a source of power had been investigated in the earliest days. Every winter, snow covered the Bogong High Plains in northeastern Victoria, and the spring thaw fed mountain streams that could be harnessed to drive generators. Where rough tracks had served only cattlemen, Commission surveyors struggled up with pack horses to measure the potential of the area. Accurate information was badly needed. Existing maps showed one river 2 miles from where it actually was. In 1937, the first Kiowa scheme was approved. And in 1938, site work began, with explosions. But there was a bigger explosion to come. Some 2,000 of the Commission's people joined the forces. 70 men gave their lives. War brought urgent demands for power and fuel. The briquette factory worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all through the war. There was a substantial reserve of generating capacity when war broke out, but during the war, demand rose by 70%. Electricity, to process food for the services, to produce arms, ammunition, war equipment, to serve the home front. Spares, equipment, and fuel were hard to get. So were men. Overload became normal. Machines were forced to produce more. It was impossible to install much new plant. Maintenance was limited. But supply was interrupted only once. In the summer of 1944, disaster struck again. Bushfires blazed in the Latrobe Valley, and flying embers were blown 5 miles onto the dry coal of the open cut. The whole of the open cut was soon burning. Even with troops helping, it took days to bring the fire under control. But ways were improvised to bring supply back to normal within a fortnight. At Kiowa, war shortages delayed development. But electricity came from the first generator in 1944 and the second in 1945 at Clover Power Station. Clover, Rubicon, Sugarloaf, Ballarat, Geelong, Newport, Yallourn. Every commission station worked to overload and supply was maintained. At last, V for victory. After years of brownout, the lights came on again, but not for long. Wartime delays to new development and maintenance took their toll, a problem that was worldwide. Electricity was rationed. Plans for spectacular new development were pushed ahead to overcome the shortage. At Morwell, there was to be another open cut, a power station, and factories to more than treble briquette production on country's then cow paddocks. At Kiowa, plans were revised to provide more than double the power planned in the 30s. Work began on the enlarged project. Another complete village was built. Hostels were transported bodily up the mountain roads. This was the first hydro project in the Australian Alps, a prototype for the Snowy Mountains scheme, which was to start building in 1949. There were shortages, men, material, equipment, but the work went ahead. Tunnellers drove their way through rock hundreds of feet underground, carving out tunnels for the racing water, caverns for the power stations. The Morwell project started with site work for the open cut, the power station, and the briquette factories. In 1949, Commissioner Wilfred Chapman became chairman for a brief period before the appointment of Ralph Hunt, an engineer who'd been associated with the Yallourn development from the start. To meet the shortages of men, the Commission sponsored its own migrants. To accommodate them in the Latrobe Valley, a whole township of prefabricated houses was imported from England. The shortage of materials became so severe that the Commission bought a ship of its own and chartered others to transport urgently needed timber and cement. And just as men and materials were becoming available, another shortage struck. This time, money for new development. Work on new projects was drastically slowed. Men had to be laid off. Equipment was stored. Material lay idle. At Morwell, construction came to a standstill. Some progress was made. Newport Sea Station was completed. Operating continuously, it became a source of supply as important as the generators of Yallourn. More fuel became available. Arrears of maintenance were overhauled. Other stations came into service. In 1952, rationing ended. Progress was made in distribution, too. Self-help schemes, with country consumers advancing money against the cost of the lines to bring them power, meant that electrification of country districts could go on. A new power line now linked Kiowa with Melbourne. At 220,000 volts, it was another first in Australia. In 1954, lights spelled out a welcome. There was a especially enthusiastic welcome for Queen Elizabeth II when she came to Yallourn. The Commission's charter enjoins it to conduct the enterprise on behalf of the Crown. The Queen saw for herself how the trust was carried out. What had been bushland less than 35 years before was now a huge power complex. The Queen saw the first extensions built at Yallourn since the 1930s, Yallourn Sea Station. Another power line, at 220,000 volts, now ran from Yallourn to Melbourne. Around the state, 5 package power stations were installed to meet the continuing rise in demand. At Kiowa, work had begun again on the Rocky Valley Dam. 5,000 feet up in the Australian Alps, there was to be a huge reservoir to trap the snow waters of the Bogong High Plains. From this reservoir, water would run through raceways, tunnels and pipelines to drive the generators of the scheme's 3 power stations. 1956, television, a new form of entertainment and a new use for electricity. And on the television screens, viewers saw the Olympic Games. In the same year, Chairman Willis Connolly took office. He had been an engineer with the Commission since the early Yallourn days. The Commission now generated 99% of Victoria's electricity, but power stations worked to capacity to provide this. There was still no margin. So work went on to keep pace with demand and to get ahead of it. At Yallourn, giant new dredgers, bucket wheel dredgers, increased coal output. More coal would soon be urgently needed to supply the furnaces of Yallourn D station, now building. Before Yallourn D was finished, Yallourn E would be planned and approved, giving the station 8 times the original output of Yallourn A, built in the 20s. And now, from the Morwell project, came power and briquettes. In the new Morwell open cut, bucket chain dredgers, dwarfing those first used at Yallourn, loaded coal onto the conveyors. With the new factories in operation, production of briquettes rose to 5,000 tons a day. The Kiowa scheme was complete. The high plains snow no longer melted to streams rushing down the gullies. The water was controlled to produce electricity. Hydroelectricity also came from the Great Snowy Mountain scheme. Victoria, New South Wales and the Commonwealth had agreed to share the output of this hydro project. In 1959, the first power flowed into the Victorian grid. This link meant that Victoria and New South Wales could exchange electricity to the advantage of both. The total mileage of high voltage lines was now so great that helicopters were used to patrol them. And still more high voltage lines were building. Across gullies in broken country, linesmen used rockets to carry the lines. There was still hard country and hard work. The days of the bullocky were gone, but men were still turning plans to action, bringing power to more and more of Victoria. The first arrival of electricity in a country district was a moment for celebration. At the peak of supply development, switch-ons in the country happened almost weekly. By the end of the 60s, there were only a few thousand isolated homes without supply, and the lines were reaching towards them. And in Melbourne, demand was increasing. There was a sudden, astonishing burst of new construction. Buildings went up that used more electricity than 1,000 homes. More people to use electricity, more uses for electricity. With demand increasing all the time, generation had to increase too. When Yallourn E was completed in 1962, the Latrobe Valley stations passed 800 megawatts. But this was to be dwarfed by the next project, Hazelwood Power Station. To provide cooling water, an artificial lake, area 2 square miles. The building, 1/3 of a mile long, more than 200 feet high. Eight towering boilers producing steam. 8 turbines driving 8 generators. Output per generator, 200 megawatts. Total, 1,600 megawatts. By world standards, a major power development. To carry this power, more lines were built at 500,000 volts, another pioneer venture in transmission in Australia. Each line carries 24 times the power carried by the original line built less than 50 years before. 50 years of service to provide Victoria with power. To serve industry. Power to serve agriculture. power for transport, power for commerce, power for homes. This progress depends on commissioned men and women, the many thousands who served in the past, the 20,000 of today. The Commission, with 1.25 million customers, has taken electricity to every corner of the state. The work has grown so much that only computers can handle the figures. The State Electricity Commission of Victoria has given 50 years of service to its customers and owners, the people of Victoria.